So I just want to start out by saying that I really love tech. I'm a gadget person, and I love using tech, especially the fact that things like I can track my sleep on an app, or I can get woken up by a silent alarm on my smartwatch. And on days where I don't feel like working out for myself, I can use my phone to see how restful my sleep was. But like all great love stories, you might think it's a great love story, or you might think it's a bit cliche. My relationship with tech is a bit complicated. As someone who works in the industry, as well as an avid consumer, I've seen firsthand the ways in which people can be excluded or even harmed by tech. I can tell you that coming from a working class background, I know that growing up, my family would never have been able to afford some of the devices that I now use on an everyday basis. And today, cost remains a hugely limiting factor in enabling people to access tech. In fact, 41% of the world's population fail to have regular access to the internet. And if we look at the other end of the wealth spectrum, we're seeing the prevalence of more and more autonomous vehicles hitting our roads. And studies suggest that if I happen to be crossing the road at the same time as some of my friends or colleagues, I'm more likely than they are to get hit by one of these vehicles simply because I have dark skin. Due to a lack of data, diversity, and regulation across the industry, bias and exclusion exist in tech. And it's not just having dark skin or coming from a low-income background that means that you could be impacted by this. This is a problem that impacts people from every cross-section of society, and sometimes you might be impacted without even realizing. I found this infographic on Twitter, and I think it does a really good job of showing how power and privilege are distributed across society. The central ring shows groups that have traditionally faced the most privilege, whilst the outer ring demonstrates groups that have faced marginalisation. And even though this diagram wasn't produced to show bias in tech, I found it really useful when I was thinking about my own experiences and how I interact with technology, and I thought that you might find it useful too, so I've shared it here today. I'd like to walk through some examples that maybe you could relate to. So let's say you didn't have a background like I did, and you identify as middle class or even rich, and you want to spend some of that cash on a smartphone. Well, if when you go to buy that smartphone, you also pick up something like a pop socket or another phone accessory to help you hold on to your device, I'm willing to bet you also identify as a cisgendered woman. And the reason for that is that at 5.5 inches, the average smartphone is actually too big for most women to comfortably hold in one hand. Let's take just another example. Disability awareness groups have come out in praise of technologies like digital assistants and smart homes for the benefits they've brought about for people across the globe. And I'm sure we can all think of loved ones that could benefit from this technology. If I think about my grandma, she's not as mobile as she used to be. And I know the ability to turn the lights off or lock the door with a voice command could be really quite liberating for her. The problem is though, my grandma has a Jamaican accent, and I know if she were to ask Alexa, and I'm sorry if I've just set up a load of devices, if she were to ask Alexa to close the blinds, she might get a response like, "I'm not quite sure I understand," or "I don't know how to do that yet." And when I sat and thought about it, it really confused me. Should people miss out on the benefits that the post-digital world has to offer simply because of their background? That didn't sit right with me. And if it doesn't sit right with you, you might be wondering, what can be done to ensure that everyone gets to enjoy the post-digital world? Several of the issues that we've just walked through can be attributed to 3 key factors. As any developer will tell you, a product is only as good as the data that it's built upon. And the historical exclusion of marginalized groups from research means that there are gaps in historical and current data sets. And this goes hand in hand with the lack of diversity in background, experience, and expertise from decision-making groups. Together, these factors uphold and maintain a broken product cycle where products are produced, peer-reviewed, and signed off by similar thinking groups, and they can only be sure that the products that they develop work for people who are just like them. Fortunately, the future of tech doesn't have to look like this. We now have the technical capabilities to collect and analyze data at a volume and speed that's only increasing. We're also able to connect with people who share just one thing in common, and that's an interest in tech from all around the world, with an ability to share ideas and collaborate in real time. By bringing these people together and leveraging that data, we can create regulations to make sure that everyone gets to enjoy the post-digital world. And fortunately, the industry is starting to make these changes. Last year, companies such as IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon all made announcements about how they were going to safeguard the public against the misuse of facial recognition technology. And I was really excited to see these announcements. If you saw these announcements at the time, you might remember that the backdrop of these announcements were the anti-racism protests that took place following the death of George Floyd by police in the US. Some people might be wondering, what's the connection between anti-racism protests and facial recognition technology? Well, studies show that algorithms developed in diverse countries, such as the US, are much less accurate depending on your ethnicity and gender. One study showed that African American and Asian American men were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified by this technology than their white counterparts. And to put that into context, that means if you were to search a database for images of Barack Obama and Joe Biden, you would be shown 100 people that weren't Barack Obama, for every one you would be shown that wasn't Joe Biden. You might now start beginning to see that selling racist software to institutions also accused of racism is probably not a good idea. And like me, you would have welcomed that these companies were beginning to self-regulate and take a stance against the industry. However, there are people out there who would argue that this change has come much, much too late. Among those people might be Asian American blogger Joz, who wrote about the hurtful prompt her camera made after she took a selfie back in 2010. And over the course of developing this presentation, I've seen this image 1,000 times, but every time I see it, it genuinely shocks me. Because if Joz were to go to a professional photographer and the photographer asked her, after reviewing the photo, "Did you blink?" we would all be outraged. And I think we need to be making sure that we're holding technologies to the same standards that we're holding each other. It's just not acceptable. Joining Joz to argue that this change has come too late is Robert Williams, who back in 2019, and 2019 was just 2 years ago, and it feels like a completely different world now, he was arrested in front of his 2 young daughters as they watched on in tears, simply because he had been misidentified as a thief against a picture of his driving license photo that had been stored in a database. If for over 10 years, a whole decade, a single technology is able to propagate offensive stereotypes and cause harm to ethnic minorities, it genuinely worries me to think of what else might be out there, currently unregulated. If these experiences tell us anything, it's that the time to do something and the time to make a difference is now, and we don't have the time to waste before making that change. If at this late stage you're still wondering, why have I called my talk "Hey Siri, do we live in a post-digital world?" And as you know, the task of the day is to think of a response to that same question. And other than the fact that I thought it was quite funny to ask that question to Siri, the point is, if we want to live in a world or work in an industry that's a more equal one, we cannot ask technology those questions yet. The fact is, your access to the post-digital world is heavily dependent on who you are and where you come from. So if you haven't faced bias or exclusion in tech yet, what's to say that the next innovation just doesn't work for you? But like I said, I truly love tech. I love using it. I'm an avid consumer. But I want to be sure that the post-digital world works for people who are like me, but also for people who aren't like me. And thank you for listening.